Good evening, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to the Alex Thomas Show. Again, apologies for being a little late, but there's so many great things going on here at Riverside. But no more delays. I'm going to jump right in because I'm incredibly excited and appreciative to have Matt Siegfried.
Hi, thanks, Alex.
Thank you so much for coming here, and you're very welcome. Why don't you tell our audience, give your standard intro, or what do you do when you're doing your media spots around the world?
My name is Matt Siegfried, and I'm a historian based here in Ypsilanti. I'm a graduate of Eastern Michigan University, and I have degrees in history, archaeology, and historic preservation. But before that, I had a whole life as a union meat cutter for 15 years, and ended up having to find other things to do during the Great Recession, and ended up going to school and went to school here at Eastern, and made all of my schooling about Ypsilanti and local history. And my point was not to do sort of celebratory local history, but show how the big national and international forces and movements and events shaped and were played out here. So the civil rights movement didn't just happen in Birmingham, Alabama, it happened here. You know, the Civil War just didn't happen in the South, it happened here. Reconstruction didn't happen in the South, it happened here. What did it look like here?
So you can see why I was so excited about having Matt on. And to jump on, and what when you started about the civil rights struggle, and we mentioned earlier, and you wanted to really talk about, I believe you said 1945, 1955 and such?
Something around
there.
Yeah.
That excites me because my beloved neighborhood, West Willow, the largest in Ypsilanti Township, it was founded because it's just to the west of the Willow Run site, which housed the Arsenal of Democracy, which we're going to jump right into.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that.
And then later, the two General Motors plants that closed in 1992 and 2010. It took a third of the township's budget with it, and created this reality that we have here in the area right now that matches so many Midwestern.
That's right. And as we're talking, GM is about to close down the Hamtramck Poletown plant in Lordstown, and a lot of production actually was moved from this plant to those plants when this plant closed. So we're seeing the continuation of that process in other communities, which will have the same effects as it had on this community. You
know, I'm a proud multi-generation UAW kid. Both grandfathers, both parents, and such. And I hope we only have, because we're going to dive into that pre-war, World War II history and that period. But I hope we get a chance to talk about exactly like when you mentioned the plants closing. There's a reality in today's economy that with automation and such, there's going to be more plants that close.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, but and just recognizing those global realities. What does the union fight look like right now? Because we still need to protect. But let's jump into you know, because I knew that Ypsilanti was your expertise and you were really interested in, and then you immediately jumped into that period, 1945, 1955. We're about there.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, a couple of reasons. The first reason is that this area's population something like quadruples in that period. So much of the, Ypsilanti was a relatively small town before World War II. During World War II, many of the communities that we take for granted as being Ypsilanti Township or Ypsilanti communities came into being.
Would I be safe? Excuse me. Would I be safe in that prior to World War II that the city's population was higher than the township?
Oh yeah. Definitely. And then during World War II, the township's population eclipsed Ypsilanti quite a bit.
Yeah.
So you see a real change, a real shift in where people live, the demographics of the people living there, what they do. Politics changes. So Ypsilanti goes from a Republican town to a stronghold of the Democratic Party and unionism. It went from a place that Ford controlled to a place that the UAW controlled.
And I just want to point out, and everyone knows, the audience though, but when you said that the township population exceeded, because it surprises so many people that there's 55,000 people in the township and about 22 or 23,000 in the city.
That's right.
And I hope, and I'll give you more time, and I think you've touched on it, how that those jurisdictions and that that division among precincts, county commissioners, school districts, and how that affects the most vulnerable and working class population. But go ahead. So the township and the city.
So that's really key. So and where people live and what they did and who got employed where was largely the product of a struggle. And the most important civil rights struggle Ypsilanti ever had, Michigan ever had, is that period during World War II. And it is a struggle led by unions and black organizations to desegregate, to get access to war industries and war housing for black workers. And in that process is also a unionization struggle, so for all workers. So it becomes, and we're talking not about a few hundred people, we're talking about tens and hundreds of thousands of people involved in the struggle in Michigan, both for the unionization and the desegregation campaigns. And out of that struggle comes the first black elected officials in Ypsilanti, comes all kinds of changes where people can live, and changes in federal housing policy, and changes in employment practices, and changes in the political makeup of municipalities here. So it's a major touchstone period for this area.
To give it a little context, my understanding when I think about the Great Migration in terms of that African Americans from the South moving up to North in the manufacturing jobs, I'm thinking early 1920s, beginning.
Yeah, so between World War I and II, but Ypsilanti's different than that.
Right. So, but we had that because the story in Ypsilanti you pick up in like 1945. So I'm thinking that Great Migration came to the Detroit area, and such. We have the city here. Everything's pretty rural. Late 30s and then early 40s, and then the site comes up.
And that's absolutely true. And what makes Ypsilanti so unique and special is that Ypsilanti has a very high percentage of black population well before the Great Migration, well before World War I, well before the Civil War even. So Ypsilanti is one of the few places, in fact, in Southeast Michigan that has a black population of over 30% before the Great Migration begins. And that means that Ypsilanti develops differently than many other communities around here. It also means that when black people came up during the Great Migration, many people came to Ypsilanti because of an existing black community up here, an existing possibility. So you had an older community tightly connected to Canada, who had to negotiate, and the Underground Railroad and everybody being there, who had to negotiate all new people arriving up.
That present population before the Great Migration that was in Ypsilanti, was that a direct result of the Underground Railroad in Canada?
Absolutely. Okay. And so, in 1900, Michigan will have far less than 1% African American, 0.01 or something like that. Detroit will have just under 1%. Ann Arbor will have about 3% black population. Ypsilanti will have upwards to 15%. So almost unheard of in a northern city to have that, and in a Michigan city. So Ypsilanti was, in fact, we think of Detroit as the most black city in Michigan now, but by percentage of population between the Civil War and World War I, that period before the Great Migration, Ypsilanti was the city in Michigan with the highest percentage black population. And this leads to the early industrialization of Ypsilanti. So let me just put it on its head a little bit. So what you said about the Great Migration is absolutely true. It's people leaving the South and Jim Crow for opportunities in the factories of the North, Cleveland, Detroit, those kind of towns. You flip it on its head. Because of the racial nature of work and where black people worked, and black men specifically, which was foundry work, it was steel, Rouge steel. It meant that because instead of black people moving to Ypsilanti to get jobs in a steel factory or a foundry, it meant foundries moved to Ypsilanti to take advantage of black labor. So Ypsilanti becomes industrial in around real heavy industry, foundries and stuff like that, around 1900 on the basis of black labor, largely. So if people know where the Corner Brewery is now, that was U.S. Press Steel. And Press Steel was a place where most black men would work in that period. And that's well before the Great Migration. So one of the things that makes Ypsilanti, the thing that defines Ypsilanti and how it developed since the Civil War is really its black population. And I think people, when they think of Ypsilanti, they think of the history and all of that, but it had a much different character then. So Frederick Douglass is here, Booker T. Washington is here. Sometimes they didn't even go to Detroit. They just came to Ypsilanti in that period. So it was a real center of black life as well as black labor.
And that that history, when we get to 1945, and then we had that pre-existing history, did that link with that Detroit population? And then I know my original question when I was thinking, was there some union organizing already present here because of that history?
Yes. Well, yes and no. So yes, there is union organizing here. But like all union organizing at that time, or the vast majority of union organizing at the time, it's deeply racially segregated. It's craft unionism, which means that the engineers will be in their own union, the electrical workers in their own union, the plumbers in their own union. And if you don't have a skill, you're not in a union. Yeah. So if you work in the production line, it's considered unskilled. You're not in a union. And so what happens is in the 30s, what we call industrial unionization, or the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations. So if people ever heard of the AFL-CIO? Yes. The AFL was the craft union wing of that, and the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, was the industrial union organization. And that meant everybody, and when we say industry, think of like fast food industry or something like that. Everybody would be organized in the whole industry.
Did the sleeping car porters roll into the CIO, or
the sleeping car porters are interesting? I actually have some stuff in here on them, and they are organized here, and they are organized actually in the AFL, and not even though A. Philip Randolph is very supportive of industrial unionism and builds his union on the industrial union basis, they are still an AFL union.
Could you tell our audience about the sleeping?
So the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and eventually becomes and maids to the women who work there. So it's both of them. Right. Is the most important pre-CIO black union. So before the UAW, before steel workers, before all things like that, the sleeping car porters was the most important union. It was led by a man many people know, A. Philip Randolph, who was actually the person who was the instigator behind the March on Washington in '63. And he was trying to do that since '43. So for 20 years, he was trying to get that March on Washington. And if you remember, the March on Washington was for jobs. It wasn't, if you look, the name of the march is for jobs and justice and all of that. The sleeping car porters were really important, and they organized black workers on trains. And both, the people who cleaned up the trains, who took care of the trains, the maids. And it was a union that organized coast to coast. And because of the way trains work, you live in Ypsilanti and you work on the train line and go through here. It means you live in Ypsilanti, but you literally work from Detroit to St. Louis, right? Yeah. And so train work meant that you had to organize on a different basis. It couldn't just be a local basis. You couldn't just organize in one town. You had to organize the whole industry, right? Mm-hmm. And that's why A. Philip Randolph falls into this kind of industrial union category. And there are certainly black workers in Ann Arbor, Washtenaw County, and Ypsilanti who are members of sleeping car porters. Absolutely.
Who were.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And then the big breakthrough for black workers is in the 30s. And there's a couple of local organizers who are really important to that, including a man who's unknown in Ypsilanti now, but would have been really known during the period we're talking about, a man from the South Side named Ben Neely. And Ben Neely worked with Jewish organizers from the East Coast who were laundry workers and clothes workers to organize black women and men who worked in laundries here in Washtenaw County. And that was the first real breakthrough for black trade unionism here in Ypsilanti. There's also another organization called the National Negro Council. And this was a really important pre-civil rights, pre-World War II national black organization, largely influenced by the Communist Party, which is where many black activists were in the 30s. And you can understand why that was.
Absolutely. And we spoke about that before the show, because I mentioned Coleman Young was involved. But when you look in the context of the 30s, and now, what communism actually is, and but looking in the context of the 30s, what are your alternatives? What other organization was recognizing the rights of blacks and pushing for the rights of women and just the working class population?
Exactly. So you looked at the Democratic Party, and there was literally a segregationist party. They run the South, and the Republican Party could care less.
This is 30, 40 years before Fannie Lee came.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, so that's so I guess most before people let the red flags about communism go off in here, please read about it or get just a bit more sophisticated opinion about it. You mentioned the March on Washington, Philip Randolph.
Right.
I'm sure, are you familiar with Malcolm X's critique of the march? And
yes,
such?
yes.
Because he spoke about how, originally what it was supposed to be,
right.
a demand and such, and how it was, he, in his words, and I invite people to Google and check out, but he said it was co-opted by the powers that be, and really lost its strength, in his view, lost its power.
And that's in part true. And also, the UAW, that was a very big part of that movement, under Walter Reuther, and the Reuther brothers, was a very different UAW than the UAW that led the strikes that brought the UAW into existence. It was conservative, it was bureaucratic, it was looking more and more towards cooperation with management rather than a conflict with management, which is where you won those rights to begin with. And the cooperation, you tended to see those rights taken away from you. So the UAW was also different at that time, and that critique sounds pretty valid to me.
But we could go another hour on that. But I guess as we did mention, I think it's a good chance to invite the audience to look at Bayard Rustin.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I've heard a lot of people say there would not have been a March on Washington if he was one of Martin Luther King's key aides, but he happened to be a gay man also, and we're talking about early 1960s.
Right. And a past also with the Communist Party that came back to him,
but I've heard, seen interviews with Andrew Young, a lot of other associates said there would never have been, and this without his organizational skills and efforts, absolutely. Without Bayard Rustin, and this is pre-internet.
Right. Absolutely.
And everything. So that's someone.
But people should know that 20 years before the March on Washington in &63, in the summer of 1942, there was a march in Detroit of tens of thousands of people against Jim Crow. Our biggest marches for civil rights, our biggest sit-ins for civil rights in Michigan were actually during World War II. And we're talking about involving tens of thousands of people, including not just Black organizations, but a good deal of the UAW's white leadership was extremely supportive of that, and really did fight on a national level in some really trying times. Detroit in 1943 was under martial law and had pogroms against Black neighborhoods by white mobs. It was a really tough time to be organizing across race in Michigan.
I'm just thinking how well the powers that be do, how well they do of suppressing that history.
Everybody knows, everybody knows 67. Please Google Detroit 1943.
And in the 20s, were there some riots and?
Oh, absolutely.
I know in New York area and such and things like that. But were there some other big riots in this area prior to the 43?
There were not in Michigan. I mean, there were conflicts in Michigan, and many of those conflicts were, in fact, not black-white, but immigrant. And so the Klan was very big in Michigan in the 20s, very big in Michigan.
Like nationwide.
Yeah. This is really their high point nationally. And in the 20s, the Klans in Michigan, because we didn't have a huge Black population in Michigan at the time, in the 20s, the Klan's main target was Eastern and Southern European immigrants. And there had been anti-immigration laws and all of that kind of stuff, which stemmed that immigration by the mid-1920s, and it meant that many factories in places like Henry Ford that had employed those Eastern and Southern European immigrants because they could be employed for cheaper were now looking to Black labor. And so there's a push-pull to the Great Migration. Part of the pull up here is that employers could no longer had access to that cheap immigration that was coming from Eastern and Southern Europe. And we're looking to Black workers from the South as a new source of cheap labor in the big factories in the North.
It wasn't their good graces and sense of altruism?
No.
Boy, I want to get back because 1945, 1955, the bomber plant opens up. Or because in our pre-conversations that we had, I remember you said that one of the names the site was known for instead of Willow Run was Will It Run. So I guess that probably would be a good spot to.
There's a lot of myths about Willow Run, and they're combined with the myths we tell ourselves about World War II. And one of those myths is that we all got together to fight the good fight, put away our differences, put our wheel to the grindstone and beat the Nazis. And if that were true, then how do we explain the civil rights movement that happened after that? Right? If that really is what happened, how do we explain the explosion in the 1960s? If that's really what happened, then we have to explain what happened since. And that's not
women's liberation.
Or women's liberation, exactly.
To the extent it was.
Right. If, did those women, those Rosies, stay in the factories? So something happened, and we're not telling ourselves the whole story. And one of the things about Willow Run that I think, a little background to Willow Run. Willow Run was before it was Willow Run, the bomber plant. It was a big farm owned by Henry Ford, and before that, it was owned by the Quirk family, who were mayors and big landowners here in Ypsilanti, and probably still are. Quirk families. Their house is right up on a couple of blocks from here.
Q-U-A-R-K.
Q-U-I-R-k.
Okay.
They owned the Peninsula Paper Company.
Okay.
Yeah, and where the Peninsular Dam is now.
I probably went to school with some of that.
Probably did.
Cool, you give that spelling, I can see that in the yearbook.
Right, and they actually had a sugar beet farm out there because of sugar you could make out of, and they employed Polish workers and Eastern European workers. In any case, Henry Ford bought that, and so he was sitting on that land. In the 30s, he opened up a sort of a home for boys, a farm for boys, so they could learn how to be good farmers and then go work in his factory, which is kind of odd. But one of the things I think we could say a couple of things about Willow Run that dispel a couple of myths. First, when was it started to be built? So World War II for America begins December 1941. Willow Run starts to be built in the spring of 1941. So America's preparing for war already. Right. So this surprise attack at Pearl Harbor was probably not a surprise to the people who were planning Willow Run, because they were planning to build bombers.
Yeah, another shelter.
Right.
But yeah, so spring of 41 prior to December.
Right, so spring of 41 is really key to this, because Henry Ford is going to build the largest plant in America, the largest plant in the world, industrial plant. And at the same time, in the spring of 41, in the current largest plant in the world, his Rouge factory, is the unionization struggle. If I could just say a word about what happened there, because that's really key. Henry Ford was the only one of the big three. There were more than three back then, but the big three that we talk about now to employ black workers on any large scale. And the Ford Corporation have been asking for a pat on the back for that ever since. Yeah. And it wasn't paternalism, or it was paternalism. It wasn't altruism. And it was also sources of cheap labor. And it was very conscious on his part that if we hire in black workers, there will be a racial division in these plants that will prevent unionization from happening. So that he wanted a racial division in his plant. The other myth about it is, if you were a black worker at Ford, you worked at 2 or 3 plants. It's not like you could work out here or work in any Ford plant. That's not the way it worked.
And with Henry Ford, because I think a lot of our audience does know, but I'm sure a lot don't. Just Henry Ford's background with regards to race in general, how it's generally considered among historians and people.
Well, I can show this right here, which is how people viewed Henry Ford at the time.
Because I sure didn't learn about it till after I got out of school. Well, we got a audience, I got. And if you could read for, or just tell what
Ford's fascism proved. Ford was considered. The New York Times had a front page spread in the 1940s.
And I'm going to put this picture up on the site later, but that's from Detroit Free, or when is that from?
This is from what was called Hello Magazine, and it's from January 1941. So right in the period that we're talking about, right when Henry Ford didn't want us to get into World War II because he was pro-Nazi. Henry Ford was the most important purveyor of anti-Semitism in the entire English-speaking world. He had the Dearborn Independent. He put out false tracts attributed to Jews, attacking Jews. So he was a deeply reactionary, conservative person. He hated Jews. He hated foreigners. If you were from a different country and you came to work in the Ford plant, you had to take Americanization classes to learn Henry Ford's version of what it meant to be an American. So he had a view of race like many of the ruling class people of that time had of race. He was just more virulent.
And a lot of the people in our history that our kids learn about. Lindbergh,
right. Charles Lindbergh was a good friend of Henry Ford's and also an anti-Semite. Yeah. And so Henry Ford was deeply involved in anti-Semitic organizing, literally organizing. And also because of the way he organized his production on this really top-down individual level. Henry Ford owned Ford, right? It wasn't a public company shared on Wall Street or anything like that. It was the Ford family. He thought he knew best. And Henry Ford, I think one of the things we all know that Henry Ford was an admirer in some ways of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis before World War II. The real thing that should make our antennae go up is that Hitler and the Nazis were an admirer of Henry Ford. Right? That's really what we should be worried about.
I'm thinking of the German propaganda films and the factory, the German war machine.
Yes, they learned a lot from Henry Ford. They learned a lot from Henry Ford. So in any case, he has that view of race. And so his employment of black workers was in part to divide his workforce and to be able to pay people less, and because of his own racial notions about where people should work. And for him, black people should work in very hot places like Rouge Steel. And so we see the vast majority of black people working for Henry Ford, working in the foundry and working at Rouge Steel. So one of the things that
what you said, I just brought to mind my grandfather that I'm named after worked in a GM plant in Saginaw, Michigan, and probably retired like in the early 60s. But I can remember my grandmother telling me, because he worked in the foundry, and you could see where the metal went through some of his clothing and everything. So it was literally in the hottest. They always said that's where that's the only places they worked.
That's right.
And that's foundry with molten metal.
That's right.
Going around. So that brings back some.
So that's where Rouge Steel, what is now Rouge Steel, or was Rouge Steel until a couple of years ago, is where the majority of black Ford workers worked. And the other parts of the Big Three really didn't hire black workers. So as the UAW was organizing the Big Three, they didn't really have to challenge race, right? They could just organize. They could organize even on a racist basis if they wanted to. But to organize Ford, you had to organize black workers, and you had to offer them something more than Ford was going to offer. And you had to, and in that context, I think that black workers needed a couple of things before they were going to join white-led union. One, they needed to know that black issues were going to be taken seriously and at the core of this. And two, that you're going to win. Because if you don't win, we're all out of a job. Right? And there's nowhere else for us to go. And so when the UAW began organizing Ford, they put black workers at the center of that organizing. Coleman Young is one of those black workers. John H. Burton, who becomes Ypsilanti's first black mayor, is one of those black workers. Frank Seymour, who becomes Ypsilanti's first black elected official and the first black elected city council official in all of the state of Michigan, is one of those workers. So the UAW decides to put black faces at the center of its organizing for Ford, and it enlists black churches and all of that. And and a lot of those people had experience in the Communist Party in the 30s, right?
And I think you have a great picture of some of at the River Rouge plant.
Yes.
And there's, I think, the picket sign.
Let's find that.
That she's commenting about Ford's history. And we're going to put the digital copy up. But
right here.
Yeah. And what did that one? I didn't put on my glasses. So that's what it says.
3,000 women hired at the bomber plant. What? Not one Negro. Why?
Yeah. 3,000 women hired at the bomber plant. That's right. Right here in Ypsilanti Township, Willow Run site. No Negroes. Why?
Right. So, and why? Here's the answer to that. Because when black people decided en masse to join the Union in the Ford plant in April 1941, Henry Ford decided to try to break that by creating a race riot. And he actually hired black strikebreakers to attack white picketers in Detroit in 1941, thinking that it would set off a riot that would then call in the National Guard and end the strike. That's really what they wanted to do. And instead, those workers stood firm, and black workers joined them on the picket line. And in response to that, Henry Ford shut down all black hiring in Ford plants, all black hiring. He just refused after that. It was like, I gave you, it was, he said, I gave you all of these good wishes and you turned around to join the Union, therefore you're cut off. And so when Willow Run is being built and then staffed, no black people are going to be hired at Willow Run. He adamantly refuses, as the Ford company refuses. And he puts in charge of Willow Run human relations Harry Bennett, who is literally his gangster goon person who breaks legs for him. and he puts him in charge of human relations.
It's his Bull Connor.
Exactly. And because this is Ypsi and it was Ford's backyard and he controlled this place politically, Harry Bennett lives in Ypsilanti because this is where he feels safe, right? And so Harry Bennett's in charge. And so no black people are hired into Ford. And black women especially are not being hired into war industries at all during World War II, during the early years of World War II. What happens is that the bomber plant starts to get up and kind of running. Will it run becomes what people talked about until 1944. Kind of running, but there are huge problems with Willow Run. The most important problem being the turnover. There's 10% turnover a week. That means 10% of Willow Run quits and has to be hired every week.
Every 2.5 months, you have a new workforce.
Every 2.5 months, you have a new workforce.
And
absentee rates are about some days up to 17%. Nearly 20% of the workforce ain't showing up that day. And there's lots of reasons for that. The main reason is it's kind of a really bad place to work.
I'm wondering, are there deaths?
Oh, absolutely. There's deaths here. We're talking about the largest factory in the world employing tens of thousands of people, and people are told to work as fast as possible on a line that's never been worked before. Lots of people were killed and maimed on that line. And that led to lots of wildcat strikes and people organizing. So because of that huge labor turnover, Henry Ford has to get workers. And they're going to be women workers. They're going to be workers from the South. So when we say Ypsilanti, it's because Henry Ford goes to the South to get Southern Kentucky workers to come to work in his plant because he thinks they'll be anti-labor, anti-union, anti-communist, and will be very happy to earn the wages that he's going to give them compared to what they were able to earn in Harlan County, Kentucky. And he begins hiring women late, about a year after the plant opens, 9 months after the plant opened, he starts to hire women into the plant, but adamantly refuses to hire black women. Because he says they'll be troublemakers. So we're not hiring black women. And what he says is that... So
the answer to the question, why?
Yeah, that's why. That's troublemakers. Why. And Henry Ford wasn't probably wrong about that part of it. So in a nutshell, that's why black people were not hired into Henry Ford, into those plants at that time, and Willow Run. But something happened, which is the UAW simply rejected that entirely and said, we want there to be 7% black women in all plants. We want, and we will treat our union as if they are 7% black women in it. So black men and women actually got UAW positions in the local union before they ever got positions working at the plant.
Right.
And so you had black organizers, even though you didn't have black employees at the plant.
And, I said I'm a proud multi-generational UAW baby, but, or a kid or man now, but, I know because I've just the stories though, as far as being in the union and being black in the 1950s and 60s, there's going to be limited opportunities in terms of skilled trades and the types of jobs and places you're going to work. So,
well, we're really talking about two. Remember what happens between what you're talking about and what we're talking about is the Cold War happens. That's what, and the communists and the radicals and the people who built the UAW and the Coleman Young types are all kicked out of the UAW. They're all kicked out of the UAW by, starting in 1947.
Thank you for pointing that out then. So, and I think you did mention it was a much more radical, much more radical UAW when we're talking about during World War II, pre-Cold War.
Yeah, I think people would be surprised. Local 50, the bomber local, which had 45,000 members at its height, active members, and then more members outside of that. So a huge local. People might be surprised to know that beginning in 1945, a Communist Party slate was elected to lead that union. And in the following year, a Socialist Party slate was elected to lead that union. And both those slates brought into the leadership black men and women and white women as well. And so women began to take leadership roles in the union under those slates. And one of those men who became education director for Local 50 was a man named Frank Seymour. And he would organize for social services around this area because there's all kinds of workers here and there's not even sewage or plumbing in their house, let alone a place to buy groceries. So he was organizing for social services. One of those social services became Park Ridge Recreation Center. And on the basis of that organizing was elected to Ypsilanti City Council, the first black man to ever be elected to any city council in Michigan. And he was, we can show his picture too.
Yes, please.
He's a remarkable man. Here's the New Alderman from 1945. And that's from the Washtenaw Sun, one of two Ypsilanti Township, Ypsilanti black newspapers during World War II. So we had 2 black newspapers in the city during World War II and 4 Union newspapers during World War II.
And the 2 black newspapers were?
It was the Washtenaw Sun and News About Town.
Well, I just thought heard the expression of like when the American economy catches the cold, the black economy catches pneumonia.
Yes.
I'm thinking, the black newspapers, they caught up to that.
Yeah, right, exactly.
First,
no,
because
I think that's exactly right.
You just had so many and such a rich history of so many black newspapers.
The editor of the Washtenaw Sun was a man named Herbert Francois, and his kids are now. He has grandkids and great grandkids here, and there's lots of Francois still in Ypsilanti. So, and his son is a mentor at Ypsilanti High.
Wow, I've learned so much. And we have about 15 more minutes. I'm trying to. I know. Can you draw an analogy between Dearborn and Inkster, and maybe and West Willow and Park Ridge?
Yeah. Well, okay. So all of these housing is going to be totally racially segregated in this period, as it is sort of now, right? So we haven't moved on totally from how housing is built.
And I think it's important to point out by segregated and segregated by law.
By law.
Segregated by policy.
By policy, absolutely. By law and by policy. So because you have very limited areas where black people have historically lived in Michigan, at the point we're talking about, Ypsilanti is one, Black Bottom is one, Inkster becomes one in that process. They're not going to open up new areas to black homes. That's not what's going to happen. So black people are funneled into these small, teeny little areas. So the south side of Ypsilanti during the Depression of World War II doesn't get a single house built in it, except for the Park Ridge area at the end of World War II, and yet doubles in size. Right. And so we see that everywhere. So you live in people's garages and you build an extra, you turn your patio into a place to sleep and all of that kind of stuff. And that happens a lot in the white neighborhoods too, white working class neighborhoods, but it's especially pronounced in black neighborhoods. So what we see is federal housing for policy is also segregated during this period. So if no private developers are going to come in and build housing for war workers, and they weren't because there's not any money to make off of that. It meant that the federal government had to do it. But the federal government was only going to build for white workers or black workers, not integrated housing. So Willow Run, what we know of as Willow Run now, the community of Willow Run, is built exclusively for white workers. In Detroit, there's a housing project called the Sojourner Truth Housing Project, which is built for black workers. Inkster is built for black workers. Norwayne is built for white workers. Park Ridge is built for black workers. So you see this thing. But remember what we're saying. You can live in Ypsi if you're a black worker, but you can't work at the Balmer plant. You have to work in Dearborn. And in Dearborn, if you're a white worker, you don't work at Rouge Steel. You come out to work at the Willow Run plant. So we have this, they don't meet. Where people work and live doesn't meet. And it creates these huge commutes and problems and social problems.
Yes, and it works very efficiently for the guys in power.
Exactly, works very efficiently for the guys in power. So what's so fascinating to me is Willow Run now is one of the most black areas of the county, of the township. And how did it go from being built just for white people to being a place that black people would live? And that is the civil rights movement of World War II. So the UAW literally picketed, black and white workers literally picketed the building of housing for them because it was segregated. And occupied those plants and said, or occupied the building areas for these for housing areas, and eventually was able to change. Thurgood Marshall came here to Ypsilanti and to Willow to work on it. With the NAACP, we have Perry School here in Ypsilanti, and then that's named after Dr. Lawrence Perry. Dr. Lawrence Perry was a leading member of the National Negro Congress and probably around the Communist Party as well. He went to Washington, D.C. with Reverend Simmons from Brown Chapel AME and the white leader of the UAW Local 50 here, Walter Quilico, also around the Communist Party at that time. And they went to Washington, D.C. to demand change in federal housing policy, that this was just unsupportable, undoable, the way they had arranged it here in Michigan. And eventually they won that campaign. So after World War II, when every other subdivision that's being built is going to be redlined or covenanted to prevent Black people or to, get the kind of demographics that the developers want, Willow Run is federal housing and is protected by that. So it becomes the only place in suburban Washtenaw County that Black people can move to. So it goes from the place that they were not allowed to move to the only place that Black families could move to because it was federal housing. Eventually, the federal housing sells it to the township, and then the township sells it to the developers, and it changes. But even where we live and where we think a Black neighborhood and a white neighborhood, that's a product of a really serious civil rights struggle. We're talking about tens of thousands of people picketing and occupying to get those segregation bans lifted. So Dearborn is an absolutely no-go area for Black people. You're not,
a long history.
Long history. Mayor Hubbard and all of that.
I grew up, I was being told was that Henry Ford created that. He created Dearborn for whites only, and Inkster for Black only. But it's generally true, but a bit more complex.
And it's also important to notice that Henry Ford, Ypsilanti Township, Ypsilanti City, and the local real estate conglomerate all adamantly refused to build any housing here and went to lobby the federal government to say you cannot build housing here. Because it was fine for people to work at the Willow Run Bomber plant, but if they live and vote in the township,
oh my God,
then our guy doesn't get to be mayor of Ypsilanti anymore. And they wanted to prevent that at all costs. And one of the reasons Willow Run is between Superior and Ypsilanti townships is to divide the voting base that would live there between those two townships to lessen their impact on local elections. So race and class is all about where people live and work still, that where we live and work and what we think of as our neighborhoods, and we think of them as just sort of naturally that's where people live. No, they're products of where people want people to live and where people demand to live and struggle to live. That's really how that happened.
And there's so many reasons to get disenchanted with the political system, to get so frustrated, and I can understand people's cynicism and such, but I don't see any reason for ceding whatever power you have, whatever you can do, and for what powers it's going to be affecting you. And your only opportunity is to have some input on it.
And just look what these poor immigrant Black and white workers did. They organized themselves, united, and stared down the most powerful man in America, Henry Ford, and won.
Yes.
And won.
And created the reality we have around here in Ypsilanti today, in this area,
absolutely,
in the country for that matter.
Absolutely.
But I think I moved away from this area and then returned, after 10 and actually lived and stayed for like 10 or 15 years, had been away. But and what I recognized in that gap, in that time, and we're talking from 2000 to 2016. From where the difference that I noticed in that period from when I had grown up was the lack of the presence of the UAW.
Yes, that's key.
that corresponded around. I mean, just generally nationwide. But then recognizing it here, and I had and I understood that I thought I understood the impact because I understood how integral the UAW was to the political structure here, and what candidates got on the ballot and the agenda and such like that. But I didn't understand so much. I mean, there's such a history.
That's right.
And that like I said, created that reality, created the opportunities. I mean, there's just a heritage and tradition that needs to be respected and followed.
Absolutely. I think that it's clear to me as a historian that Black political power in Michigan rises and falls with the UAW. You can see the arc of it with the UAW and everything from Coleman, the people like Coleman Young, but it's more than that. It's about power in your community and the ability to pay your mortgage and all of that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. And man, so many, I guess we do have about, I'll check my time here. Our time guy. Have about 8 minutes. How do you see that waning of that difference, difference in the UAW power politically, locally, or just the difference in the power of unions now than they were before?
I don't want to sugarcoat the unions. In many cases, they were their own worst enemy the last 60 years, right?
Yeah.
And made some really poor choices. We're talking about how we've lost so many manufacturing jobs. And it's important to know that in about 1989, we were saying 50% of the township worked in manufacturing. And now it's far less than 10%.
Right.
So we're talking about a huge decrease just since 1989. But we act like that's a new story, like that's the modern deindustrialization story.
Yeah.
And Willow Run employed 43,000 people. The next company to be in Willow Run 3 years later, Kaiser Fraser, employed about 16,000 people, right? Like, so we've been hemorrhaging jobs in Ypsilanti since the end of World War II. And each factory employs less and less people. So GM at its height at Powertrain here, where so many people worked in the 1970s, was about 14,000 workers. By 1992, when it went to Texas, it was 1,200 workers, right? So that process of automation and deindustrialization, which is really a process of automation because things still get made.
Yeah.
They still get made. Has
this
been
rise in productivity and efficiency.
Exactly. That goes all the way back to World War II and the end of World War II. And we've been dealing with this for a long time, not just recently. And I think that's, if you want to know why Willow Run struggled in the 50s, it's because they lost 30,000 jobs in 1945. That's why, Willow Run was built to house 15,000 people. At the end of World War II, there were only 600 families living there because the plant had shut down. So in part, there's that. In part, it's that the UAW and the unions left the basis on which they were built and decided to continue on a different basis. So instead of trying to continue to build on which basis they were built, which is an expansion of rights and an expansion of membership, so ever increasing groups of people, so immigrants, blacks, gays, lesbians, that's the notion of the CIO was, let's expand who is represented by us. We've got a representative notion. We'll represent you in talks with other people.
Yes.
And you end up in a situation where somebody tells you it's a win-win. And this is America. Yeah. There's never been a win-win in American history. And somebody always wins better than the other person. And that's what we end up seeing, that the union signed off on the very things that were decimating the membership. So we will agree, if you don't close this plant, if you can keep 1,200 workers there, we'll agree to lose 400, right? But guess what they're going to ask for next time? A little, and in the end, you've got no workers left to defend.
And you're just an awesome historian, and you've just educated me about so much and given me a different perspective and a different way to look, and just so much to chew on.
Thank you, thank you so much for having me. Yeah. And thank you for being able to tell this kind of history. Thank you for having a platform for Ypsilanti people to tell these kinds of stories, because there's not a lot of platforms for that. So I greatly appreciate the Alex Thomas Show. Everybody like the Alex Thomas Show and watch it.
Hey, I can't say anymore. Thank you so much. You'll be back again probably next week. All right. Okay, thank you, Matt.
You so much.
Bye-bye. We'll see you next week. Thank you for tuning in. And we hit that and make sure I keep it.